1700. 1700.
Kundiawa Police Station was the main coordination centre for the Electoral Commission in Simbu Province.
1861. 1861.
It looks like an impressive operation. Ballot boxes numbered and checked, locked and tagged. Scrutineers outside the compound, eagle-eyed for any deceit.
1771.
Yet the elections in the Highlands turned out to be an elaborate and expensive sham.
1848.
Leaders give. If you want to be a leader, you have to raise a lot of money, and then you give. In return, you get your votes. And then when you get your votes, you get into parliament, and then you make a lot of money out of it.
You see, like Papua New Guinea is, we are going down, and we are going down fast. I think we are going down fast. And I think what really kills us is corruption.
Money, clan rivalry, violence, just some of the factors which encourage these voters to turn out to fulfil their democratic duty, to be given their ballot papers conveniently already marked. The Australian government spent heavily before the election attempting to improve the electoral process, and it is intending to spend a lot more. Yet elections in the Southern Highlands were so corrupted they'll have to be rerun. And in Simbu Province, despite vote rigging on a huge scale, the elections were, amazingly enough, declared valid. The local media provided dramatic coverage of the elections. We sought visas to PNG to report on them, but permission was denied. International witnesses weren't wanted.
I mean, over 30 people have been killed in the Highlands in election-related violence. Women have been raped. One of those, the first killed, was actually a young girl. A very young girl was shot by one candidate aiming at another. So, you know, this is very distressing, and we have to talk quite frankly about the situation and try and address it.
That we're now able to provide some insight into how the election was conducted in the Highlands is due to Robin Slark, an Australian human rights advocate with a dozen years' experience in PNG. She spent 6 weeks in Simbu videotaping the electoral process. The corruption of the election started with the common rolls, which were wildly inflated.
There are at least 1 million extra names somehow on that common roll. People will say, oh, name below stone or pigeon, or, you know, the names of stones, pigeons, mountains, trees are also on there. And Australia contributed money, millions and millions of dollars, to fixing up this common roll.
AusAid, the development arm of the Australian government's Foreign Affairs Department, certainly to some degree monitored its investment in the poll. In Simbu, Nick Warner, the Australian High Commissioner to PNG, along with other Australian aid officials, photographed the burning of excess ballot papers. AusAid insists, though, that it was not responsible for running the election. That was under the authority of the PNG Electoral Commission. Ross Mackay of the Australian Electoral Office was among the officials sent to PNG to improve the computer system for managing the common rolls, a project costing millions.
Well, certainly we've spent, I think it's about 7.3 up till June this year. I believe that money has been well spent. The PNG Electoral Commission did have plans, well-developed plans to cleanse the roll, so to speak, but those plans weren't able to be put into place because of a lack of funds.
Even so, it's clear that elections were much more difficult in the warrior culture in the Highlands than in other parts of the country. The capital, Port Moresby, is far away. Basic government services like health and education are erratic, and roads are often impassable. Elections aren't so much about democratic free expression as an opportunity for local big men to garner power and influence. Charting the conduct of elections in the Highlands for 25 years has been Australian academic Bill Standish.
The use of intimidation, violence and firearms in elections is something that has grown and escalated ever since 1987 that I'm aware of. And people are using whatever resources are around, and guns are part of it.
Guns were certainly used to intimidate many of the candidates who stood for election in Simbu. One of them was Maria Kale, who was nominated as a Home Affairs Minister in the provincial government. Maria spent about $20,000 and offered up 12 pigs in the hope of winning a national seat. At the last minute, she gave in to threats.
One of the candidates, competing candidates, had been firing guns at night, throwing Tommy Hawks into the ground to intimidate her people.
Thank you.
Maria Kale was forced to step down to save the lives of people in her village. She was afraid that her young men would fight or that they would be blamed if the candidate in the area near the polling station did not win.
In the village of Gu, Robin Slark filmed the clearest example of the corruption of the poll for the seat of Sinisini Yongamal. Supporters of a candidate, Peter Igi Kalale, had taken control of thousands of ballot papers. It should be stressed there's no evidence that Mr Kalale directed this to happen.
In some areas there was open mass marking of ballot papers. Presumably the people in that village had been forced to go along with this or just accepted the situation.
Into this confusion ventured another woman candidate, Sarah Maina Garrap. She was refused permission to vote. Realising that her supporters couldn't safely vote for her in the open, she asked for ballot papers to take away. She was given a small number, but then members of her clan were also refused permission to vote. By now, with the weather turning, the supporters of Peter Igi Kalale saw their chance, removing the voting slips and ballot boxes to a nearby house.
I have no idea how I was able to sneak in once the door was opened and some other people entered. I thought, I've got to get in there and film this because this is the evidence of, the problem with this election. Whilst I was in there, I was quite concerned that I may not be able to get out. It felt very much like a cloak and dagger sort of operation. The room was dark and people were very hurriedly marking thousands and thousands and thousands of papers. The presiding officer from that electoral team was there marking the back to say that these were authentic, wonderful papers. Then another 5 or so people were folding these papers and throwing them into the ballot box.
You guys relax and do your work. We are trying to send somebody to the National Parliament. Yes, sir. However, you do it. That's not matter. Just do it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, boss.
As it turned out, Peter Igi Kalale, despite the energetic efforts of his supporters, was not elected as the member for Sinisini Yongamal.
Well, he was literally outgunned. He was outgunned. People with more guns beat him.
Tensions between clans and tribes spilled over at election time. Villages were attacked. There was significant destruction of property and thousands were left homeless.
This vehicle is in good running condition.
Extra police were drafted into the Highlands, but frequently found themselves outnumbered and outmanoeuvred, as the local police commander, Samson Mape, conceded.
The people really need a lot of police to a polling booth. Maybe 10, 6. to look up the polling booth so that the officials or the voters are voting freely without threats or intimidations or whatever it is.
Police were supposed to be paid special allowances for election duty. They weren't paid on time, nor were monies forthcoming for people hired to act as electoral officials. Another example of the mismanagement of the elections. Complaints of incompetence were frequently expressed by polling officials who had experienced previous elections. The leader of Electoral Team 58 in Simbu found himself short of 900 ballot papers, and accordingly he dared not go to the nominated voting station.
I'll be thinking about the safety of my polling officials, so their life is much more important than having to go there and the risk of a life.
Yet some, like Sarah Maynard-Garrett, literally put their lives on the line to stand as candidates.
She's a single mother, she's got 5 children. She walked to 23 rest houses, up and down mountains. She didn't have a vehicle, she didn't have any funding.
When I was on my campaign trail, I walked up that mountain twice.
Sarah was leading her family and supporters down from View, where she'd been stopped from voting.
About 30 men with bush knives rushed at Sarah and her family group. The women fled to the side of the road and the men ran back down the road towards me. I expected people to be hacked in the shoulder, arm, chest, back with bush knives. Most of our people successfully fled. Sarah had the courage to just stand up and say, I'm a candidate, however I wasn't able to vote, so I'm not your enemy. Let us pass. And after about a half-hour negotiation, we were able to pass.
Me been kisim sample report along the line, all stuff close to true one black candidate. Or they talking me also, this black candidate, I'm been comment, or I'm been making one the statement. And I'm talk, look in this black coffin box, you walk about a lot. I'm on black dead body. So in a way, I'm talk of some life blow me, I'm cheap. Na suppose only like finishing me and all can make him because long I'm life from me meet you.
Votes were sold in Simbu for as little as 2 kina, less than 50 US cents.
I have absolutely no doubt that most, if not all, the presiding officers who have had to put in a report saying this election was valid knew full well that it was not. Indeed, I know one of the presiding officers had a gun put to his head and ballot boxes were taken away from him.
Yet in Simbu, all 6 winning candidates were endorsed by the Electoral Commission as having been properly elected.
How can we have a parliament that's run by criminals who've been operating in this way, using guns? These are criminal offences, they're not just electoral offences, and they're also wondering what will happen in subsequent elections. People are starting to talk about warlord politics, which is the way they're describing politics in some parts of Africa these days.
The election that we saw is really a reflection of society in PNG. So fixing an election to make it incorruptible and safe for voters and for polling officials is more than simply looking at an electoral commission.
Let's go up.
The PNG Electoral Commission declined to speak to us. The Commission and the Australian Electoral Office have begun a formal assessment of the poll. The Commonwealth Secretariat says it too intends to investigate. Ultimately, though, their recommendations have to address the key issue: how to establish an electoral system in Papua New Guinea which is transparent and open and worthy of people's trust.
Jobal.